network C-SPAN. Now a discussion on estate taxes. You'll hear from Republican Senators John Kyl and John Ashcroft, and Republican Representative Jennifer Dunn. You'll also hear from the groups the United Seniors Association, Americans for Tax Reform, and others. It's 45 minutes and was hosted by the Institute for Policy Innovation.
Good morning. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We appreciate you all coming to join us this morning. This morning, the Institute for Policy Innovation is releasing this study called The Case for Burying the Estate Tax. So we sort of reveal the conclusions of the study right there in the title. The conclusion of the study is that the estate tax is among the most insidious, pernicious, damaging, and pointless aspects of the tax code. The compliance costs associated with the estate tax are almost equal to the revenue raised. The revenue raised is an insignificant portion of the federal budget. It's less than 1%. And the estate tax, for very little benefit, does an enormous amount of damage to family businesses and to farms and to estates. We're very honored this morning to have a number of important people here to join us in supporting the study and to make their comments. But first, we're going to let the authors of the study come up here and describe their work to you, talk you through it, and mention some of the more important conclusions. We are convinced that not only are the American people being taxed to death, but it's even worse than that. Your taxes don't end when you die. In fact, you hit some of the highest marginal tax rates after you die. And your survivors, at the worst point in their lives, have to deal with the estate tax. I'd like to introduce economists Gary and Aldana Robbins, if you guys would come on up here and join me. Gary and Aldana Robbins are senior research fellows with the Institute for Policy Innovation. I should say that we're based in Lewisville, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. And they're here to discuss the report. I imagine that each of you will take a couple of moments. So let me just turn it over to Aldana Robbins.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, for being here as we release a new IPI study. Gary and I hope that our report will shed some light on one of the most arcane and complex parts of the federal tax code, estate taxes. Until recently, estate taxes were the almost exclusive headache of the super rich, their tax attorneys, and their estate planners. But a strong economy, an ever-widening distribution of wealth, both of these, of course, being good things, coupled with, unfortunately, short-sighted tax policy, are extending the reach of estate taxes well into middle-class America. Now, estate taxes in the United States date back to the Stamp Act of 1797. No, not the one that precipitated the Revolutionary War, another Stamp Act. And the purpose was to finance an undeclared naval war with France. The tax was repealed in 1802. That set a pattern for the next 100 years or so. That is, estate taxes were only used as a sporadic and temporary means to finance war. When hostilities ceased, the tax was repealed. But from the 1920s through the 1940s, estate taxes became another weapon in the arsenal to redistribute income. Tax rates of up to 77% on the largest estates were supposed to prevent wealth becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few. And the chart that we have here shows the beginning and top tax rates starting in 1916 up to the present time. Loophole closing preoccupied the tax reformers of the late 1960s and early 70s. Their efforts culminated in a 1976 tax bill that overhauled estate taxation and gave us pretty much the system we have today. The only significant tax relief has came with lower rates and an increase in the exemption that was enacted in 1981. The tax schedule has stayed pretty much the same ever since. Today, estate taxes are more likely to affect small and medium-sized estates than 50 years ago. In 1945, estates that were under $2.5 million, and that's in today's asset values, accounted for a third of all returns. In 1995, those $2.5 million and under estates accounted for 89% of estate tax returns. The main reason for the shift is the serious erosion in the value of the estate tax exemption, which is the next chart. In 1916, estates that were under $9 million, and again, that's in today's asset values, would not have been taxed. Now, contrast that with the $600,000 exemption that was in place from 1987 until just this year. We also discovered that large estates do not pay the highest tax rates. Who does? Typically, they're owners of small businesses, family farms, and savers who amass wealth during their lifetimes through hard work and thrift. Because wealth is often unexpected, these people may not be aware of or able to take full advantage of ways to reduce estate taxes. As a result, those who come late or not at all to estate planning end up paying most of the tax. I'll now let Gary tell you a little bit about how estate taxes affect the economy.
About half of all savings is directed towards bequests, but high marginal tax rates, between 37 and 55%, discourage savings, which in turn leads to less investment, slower economic growth, and lower tax revenues. What's more, the sheer complexity of the estate tax results in high compliance costs. As much as the estate tax raises, by one estimate, compliance adds nothing to economic output while diverting resources from better uses. We estimate that eliminating the federal estate tax would increase gross domestic product by almost $1 trillion over the next 10 years, increase the stock of capital in the United States by almost $1.7 trillion, and create 275,000 more jobs. Reducing estate taxes would generate sizable economic gains with little real revenue loss. Over the next 10 years, doing away with the estate tax would produce $3.67 in output for every dollar of static revenue lost. In the longer run, the ratio of GDP gain to static revenue loss would rise to $5.18, as you can see from this chart. In short, the estate tax is one of the most inefficient and wasteful features of our current tax system. Serious reduction or outright elimination of estate taxes might be one of the best legacies that the 106th Congress could leave future generations.
Thank you, Gary and Aldana. Gary and Aldana, of course, will be available at the end of this session to answer any specific questions that you have or to review some more of the results of the study. We're very honored this morning to have a number of very important people here to share in this work and to express their opinions on the estate tax. We're going to start off with Senator John Kyl. Senator Kyl?
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
You bet. Sorry, I'm just a little bit late. This is a tremendous report, and I hope that all of you here will take time to visit with the authors of the report, understand the details of what they've gotten into here, because it can really help us in developing public policy. I know that some of my colleagues from the House are here to discuss their legislation, and I can tell you that my Senate Bill 56, which already has 22 co-sponsors, and I haven't even tried to get co-sponsorships yet, our legislation has always had more co-sponsors than all of the pieces of legislation to tinker around the edges of the estate tax. I repeal it outright, and it's always had much more support. Why? Because in their gut, the American people understand that it's wrong. Now, they accept the fact that death is inevitable and that even taxes are inevitable. But they do not accept the fact or the policy that death should be a taxable event. Even for people who will never have to worry about filing the papers or visiting with the attorneys and the accountants and doing all of the other work to try to avoid paying the tax. Even those people understand that it is wrong as a matter of public policy. The report that you've heard about here establishes the fact that it's the most inefficient tax we have. The costs of compliance about equal the cost of the revenue to the federal government. As compared with the income tax, which costs about a penny on the dollar to collect, this tax costs roughly 7 cents on the dollar to collect. It is a very inefficient tax. Its repeal will create 275,000 new jobs, will create a tremendous amount of revenue to the economy, as was just pointed out. And so why have a public policy that taxes death, that's bad for the economy, that's bad for the family? Well, there's one justification for this tax, and I'll close with this point. The reason the death tax exists is because many years ago, wise people in the Congress wanted to do something to prevent the concentration of wealth. And so they were going to accomplish that through the death tax. Well, what happens? My great friend Jerry Wysotsky out in Arizona, he moved from New York to Phoenix. One person started a little printing company, built it up over time, he and his wife Helen. Jerry, unfortunately, contracted cancer. He died recently. Now his daughter Pearl and his wife Helen have tried to figure out how can they pay the estate taxes on what has now become a very profitable family business. Employs a lot of folks and is one of the finest printing companies in Arizona. They finally concluded, after paying thousands and thousands of dollars to accountants and lawyers and others, that there was no way to do it. You know, she bought the insurance, she did all of the other things that you do to try to figure out a way to do it. But in the end, the estate taxes were too high, and they had to sell the business. So they sold this little family business to, you guessed it, a big international conglomerate. So much for preventing the concentration of wealth. The policy is wrong. The economics are wrong. There is no fairness to it. It needs to be repealed, and if we repeal it, we will make the economy better, we'll create more jobs, and we will have a more just society. I don't know what else anyone can say about it, and this report backs up all that I've just said. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Congresswoman Jennifer Dunn is also here with us this morning, and Congresswoman.
Happy St. Patty's Day, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with the Robins and Senator Kyl and Congressman Weller this morning to support the effort on behalf of getting rid of the estate tax, or the death tax, as we call it. It's such an unfair tax. The most important thing about it is that within 9 months after the death of a family member, the children have to go in and sometimes pay up to 55% on the assets that they have inherited. It's a devastating time for them to have to be visiting with the undertaker and with the CPA all in the same few months. But also, it's really a very onerous tax on the backs of people who have worked through their whole lives and put their hearts and souls into developing a place of employment, a family business, a family farm. In the case of my district, often a small little timber farm. One example, and I think John Kyl really hit it on the head when he told you about somebody whom he represents in the state of Arizona and how they suffered as a result of this tax. In my district, in a little town called North Bend, Washington, Helen Anderson inherited some acreage of timberland from her father. Because the death tax on that property was nearly 50%, she had to go in, and there really weren't saleable assets right there on that property. They had the implements of the farm, they had the land, they had the trees. So what do you do if you want to keep the property? She did what anyone would have had to have done in that case. She went out and she had acreage cut, but it was old growth forest that she had to cut at this time. And so who suffers as a result of that? First, the people in the community who may like to drive by and look at this beautiful property. Then the joggers and the hikers, because she had opened up pathways in her property for them to enjoy. The animals. People lose, a whole community loses, and our nation in the long run loses when somebody has to sacrifice in this way just to pay taxes to the federal government. Now, I agree with what the Robins have said, and particularly with what Aldona has said about the history of the death tax. You need to keep it in perspective. Early on, the death tax was implemented for a short period of time, never more than 6 years, 3 times in order to fund wars on behalf of our nation. And then the tax was removed again. But when we leaped back in, when the government got its hand in the pocket of the citizens of this nation in 1916, we have never provided relief from that time on. So I'm here to support the Robins in their study, to support Senator Kyl and the good things that he's doing in his death tax bill on the Senate side, to support Congressman Weller and the work that he and I are doing together, and particularly to give you a little pitch on H.R. 8, which is my death tax bill. Congressman John Tanner, who is a Democrat from Tennessee, and I are co-sponsoring H.R. 8, and this is death tax removal at the rate of 5% a year, every year until 2010, and we will rid ourselves of the death tax. I like that rate reduction. That's the only way you can phase out this onerous and burdensome tax eventually and never have to deal with it again. So I urge you to take a look at that piece of legislation. Obviously, the leadership on the House side believed it was important because they assigned a number to that bill that is in the H1 through H.R. 10, the designation of the most important bills on our docket. And I want to thank the Robinses for their good work and thank all the coalitions that are behind us in wiping out this terrible tax, and just urge them to keep up the good work.
Thank you, Congresswoman Dunn. We appreciate that. Congressman Weller of Illinois is here, a member of the Ways and Means Committee and a co-sponsor of several estate tax reduction bills, including Congressman Cox's and Congresswoman Dunn's.
Well, good morning. It's a real privilege to be here and also to salute the Robins and the good work of the coalition with the study that's being announced today. Senator Kyl and Congresswoman Dunn, friends and allies in a cause I think that all of us agree on, and that is addressing unfairness in the tax code. I'm here today both on behalf of myself but also on behalf of Chris Cox. I serve as Vice Chairman of the House Policy Committee, and Chris is the Chairman of the Policy Committee, and like Jennifer Dunn has been one of the leaders in the House working to eliminate the death tax. People often say, well, gee, why do we want to eliminate the death tax? Well, we want to simplify the code because the death tax complicates the tax code. And we also want to address the unfairness in the tax code. And that's why Jennifer and I have partnered, as have others, in putting together a package of tax simplification, the Lifetime Tax Relief Act, a legislation that simplifies the code and brings fairness to the code by eliminating the death tax, eliminating the marriage penalty, and addressing other areas of unfairness in the tax code. But it's good policy to eliminate the death tax. I often think, as someone who comes from a fifth-generation family farm, I look at the death tax in terms of how it affects my neighbors and people I've known all my life, people who have worked hard all their lives to build some equity and build up a family business that they want to pass on to their kids. And unfortunately, if you look at studies such as the Robbins study that's released today, and you look at statistics over the years of how the death tax has affected family farmers and family business people, you'll see that almost 3/4 of family farms and family businesses go out of business when the founder passes away. And the chief reason is the death tax. Now, our friend Chris Cox says when the family business goes out of business, that's a 100% tax on the employees. Because of the death tax, those individuals who worked for that family business that went out of business because of the death tax, they lost their jobs. That really illustrates the unfairness in the tax code. Also, because I represent the south suburbs in Chicago, we have another issue which is gaining in importance, which really illustrates another reason that the death tax is unfair. Many of us care about preservation of prime farmland, open space. You hear the terms about smart growth? Well, the death tax actually encourages suburban and urbanization and development of prime farmland. And let me give you an example. I think of the Crawford family. The Crawfords are friends of mine. They're fifth-generation farmers like my family. They happen to have farmland up in the growing suburban area at the northern part of the district that I represent. But Grandpa died. And because of the value of that land for development purposes, they were forced to sell some of the family farmland to pay the death tax. Now, what was once prime farmland is now a subdivision. So clearly the death tax is bad for the environment as well. With that, I want to salute the Robinses, and I also want to thank Senator Kyl and Congresswoman Dunn for your leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Weller. We are expecting Senator John Ashcroft, but he's not here yet, so we're going to continue with some of the advocacy groups that are also here to say kind words about the study and to say bad words about the estate tax. I'd like to welcome Jim Martin from 60 Plus.
Thank you, Tom, and I thank the Institute for this study, and I also want to thank Gary and Aldona Robbins. I like to call them my economic guiding gurus. on the issue of repealing the death tax. They provide the intellectual arguments for repeal of this tax. I like to say that I came here back in 1962 as a young newspaper reporter more than 3.5 decades ago. So I've seen a lot of taxes come. I haven't seen very many go yet. Here's a tax whose time to go has come. It has no socially redeeming value. And quite frankly, I represent 500,000 seniors, none wealthy that I know of, but they are morally outraged by a tax which is essentially a tax on after-tax assets. We had a poll done last year. 77% of the public across the political spectrum said they would vote for their member for total repeal. Not that they're personally affected by it, but they are outraged again by the unfairness of this particular tax. And to those that say it's a tax cut for the rich, I say that horse is dead, dismount. The rich don't pay this tax. The Bill Gateses, the Ted Turners, they don't pay it. They have the lawyers and accountants to protect their after-tax assets. They set up foundations, as we know, and that's good. Or Oprah Winfrey, who said on her TV show a year or so ago in a program, she said, you know, I pay 40-some, 50-some% of my income in taxes. And she said, how much can Uncle Sam take later? You mean up to 55%? She said, I find that irritating, to quote her. It's the mom and pops, it's the small tree farmers, as Congressman Weller said, as Congresswoman Dunn has said, as Senator Kyl says, small businesses. It's the Chester Thigpens, if you will, the 87-year-old grandson of slaves, the Mississippi tree farmer, a delightful gentleman who has testified before Ways and Means Committee. He's too ill to travel now. He's got a small tree farm in Mississippi, some several hundred acres of land. He is, I guess, tree rich, but cash poor. And clearly, when he dies, an editorial pointed out that he had, by the way, had won, he had been named the Mississippi Tree Farmer of the Year a few years ago for doing everything ecologically sound. He was then named National Tree Farmer of the Year for his ecology practices. But an editorial pointed out, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, but certainly true, that when Mr. Thigpen dies, this gentleman at 87 years old, that probably his children, not having any liquid assets, will either have to sell off that entire farm that he's worked 60 years to develop, and his children have worked on it all through their lifetimes. But they may have to sell off perhaps a immature swath of trees to raise the capital to try to keep it within their family. And of course, this would then upset the ecology. So Chester Thigpen is caught betwixt and between, if you will. So I'd close on this note. We call this thing many things. Congressman Kyl, Congressman Cox and Senator Kyl have called it the death tax. It's been called a grave robber's tax, a grim reaper's tax, job robbing tax, the exit tax. I know these sound rather macabre. The departure tax, I heard recently a while ago, corpse tax. I'm going to add that to my repertoire. The cruel tax, it may be the cruelest tax of all, in that, as Jennifer Dunn has pointed out, it's cruel in that while you're grieving over the loss of a loved one, the first claimant in line is Uncle Sam, not even a blood relative, waiting for up to 55% of your after-tax assets. So again, we salute members for calling for repeal, and Congresswoman Dunn, I'd like to give you credit for a good line that we use now around the country. She has said that, we're issued a certificate at birth, a license at marriage, but should we be given a bill at death? I think not. Dying should not be a taxable event. Let's kill it a fourth and final time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Senator John Ashcroft of Missouri has been kind enough to join us this morning. And without further ado, Senator, would you come to the podium?
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to have the opportunity of being here and glad to see the House leadership here and working together on this. Will Rogers once said that the difference between death and taxes was that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. It seemed to me that armed with the facts contained in the report that's been unveiled here today, we have before us the opportunity to prove Mr. Rogers wrong. We should have Congress meet for the benefit of relieving us from a tax. And I won't rehearse all of the problems with the death tax, the so-called estate tax. but it's money that we've paid tax on. It's a tax on a tax, and it seems to me that one bite at the apple at least ought to be sufficient at a time when we're looking into the future with the opportunity for sending some of the resource back to the people who earned it. This is a clear opportunity to do it in a way which is very productive and helpful. I think it's a scandal that Americans in every state and community are forced to sell their family businesses, forced to sell their family farms in order to pay a federal estate tax. It's time to repeal it. Congress should stop trying to reform it or to fine-tune it. It's an inherently unjust double tax that's an insult to the productive efforts. And it's an insult to the idea that we take care of ourselves and we take care of our families. When we try to take care of ourselves and our families through businesses or assets or resources, government steps in to say, no, we want the lion's share. You know, it's kind of interesting to note what the Constitution provides. The Constitution in Article 3 prohibits the federal government from confiscating a person's estate for the crime of treason. It's sort of an anomaly here, that you can be a treasonous individual and not lose your estate. But if you're just a noble, patriotic, hardworking American and you die, the federal government might come to take 55% of it. That particular thought really is distressing. In Oprah's words, irritating, I guess, would be an understatement. It is time to repeal the death tax. It hampers our economy. It really lowers our standard of living. Abolishing the death tax would, over the next 10 years, produce more than $700 billion in additional economic growth, create nearly 236,000 new jobs, and enhance our nation's standard of living and create opportunity. It is time to repeal the death tax. It assaults both our economy and our culture's sense of justice, yet it generates less than 1% of all federal revenue, and recent studies, the one unveiled here today, conclude that it may not raise any revenue on the net at all. It's with that in mind that I think we should say that it's time to relieve Americans of the onerous prospect of having to visit the undertaker and the IRS on the same day. It's time for us to abolish the estate tax. Thank you.
Thank you. Exactly. I think we maybe should conclude right there. That's a great line. Karen Kerrigan is here with the Small Business Survival Committee. I think survival is an appropriate word for us this morning, Karen.
This morning it is, you bet. Thank you. Again, my name is Karen Kerrigan. I'm president of the Small Business Survival Committee. We are a national nonprofit small business advocacy organization with over 50,000 members nationwide. And we also work with over 100 state and local business groups on issues important to small business here in the nation's capital and also state capitals throughout the country. Let me first thank the Institute for Policy Innovation for producing an extraordinary and compelling report for repealing death taxes. It will greatly add to our growing and irrefutable documentation that we already have that death taxes are unproductive, they're inefficient, they're costly, they're destructive, and as we're learning today from all of our speakers and from the report, they are entirely unfair. The Joint Economic Committee, in another recent report, said it best when they said that death taxes have no redeeming qualities. The small business sector wholeheartedly agrees, as the dissolution of family-owned businesses in America are the byproduct of this insidious death tax. A few of the speakers mentioned here today the fact that many of the heirs of businesses are socked with a bill at death that they didn't know that was coming, and if they had perhaps the time to plan, maybe they could avoid this and pass that business on to the next generation. But the whole estate planning process and passing on that business to the next generation, planning for that, is a very, very expensive endeavor. And many of them can't afford it. And if they can afford it, what you're doing is you're taking those resources out of the productive private sector, resources that can go into job creating, creating better paying jobs, more jobs for the community, innovation, growing the economy, and instead basically putting it into an unproductive realm. So let me just say again that we think this report is very important for moving this issue forward. We thank, of course, the leadership of Senator Kyl, Chris Koch, Congressman Weller, as well as Congresswoman Dunn on their efforts, and we look forward to taking this report on Capitol Hill and also through state capitals nationwide to repeal this very unfair tax.
Thank you, Karen. One of Karen's compadres, Brian Reardon of the NFIB, is here with us this morning. Brian.
Thank you, Tom. As Tom said, I'm Brian Reardon. I'm with the National Federation of Independent Businesses. We represent 600,000 businesses nationwide. We have members in all 50 states. We have members in all the congressional districts in the country. We have members like Barry. Barry's family has owned gas stations in Kentucky for 3 generations, but Barry's father is getting older, and Barry worries how the family can pay the death tax and still keep the business. We also have members like Joe. Joe and his family operate a 2nd-generation printing shop in New Jersey. Joe says he and his brothers will have to sell the business when their mother passes away because they don't have the assets to pay the death tax. We have members like Melvin. Melvin is 68 years old. He has a 3rd-generation farm. It's been in the family since 1929. Melvin knows his family will have to deal with the death tax, but he's been too busy running the farm, keeping 8 people employed. He hasn't had time to deal with it. And we have members like Brad. Brad's family has been paying death tax insurance. I think that's something that's come up earlier in the conversation today. $36,000 every year just to pay the death tax when his father passes away. Each of these families knows from experience what Gary and Aldona's study makes very clear. First, smaller and smaller businesses are being hit by the death tax. For these small and medium-sized businesses, planning the death tax means less resources to grow and to hire new people. For some, it means liquidation or a fire sale. Second, eliminating the death tax would result in gains to the American economy and the federal treasury, not losses, as the JCT would tell you. Barry, Joe, Melvin, Brad, and many others could tell you exactly from personal experience why this is the case. It's for these reasons that eliminating the death tax is critical to family businesses and the economy. It's why the death tax elimination is NFIB's #1 tax cut priority. This Congress, we thank Gary and Aldona for their impressive report. We thank Congresswoman Dunn, Senator Ashcroft, and others for their leadership on the Hill, and we look forward to eliminating the death tax this Congress. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Small businesses are not the only family enterprises that are hammered by the estate tax. Family farms are devastated by estate taxes. And this morning we have Jack Laurie with the American Farm Bureau Federation to tell us more about that. Jack.
Well, thank you very much. And this is an exciting morning for agriculture to hear the comments that were made by our senators and congressmen who represent our feeling on this issue. My name is Jack Laurie, and this morning I'm representing the nearly 5 million member families of the American Farm Bureau Federation who believe that the death tax should be killed. You know, like it or not, American farmers are aging. 1/3 of our farmers in this country are of retirement age, and so they have to make that decision. The decision is, how do I pass the farm on to the next generation? In many cases, the assets that are required to make this transition are more than the farm can raise, and so consequently a portion of that farm is spun off in order to make the transition from generation to generation. When we do that, we find then that the size, the scale of the operation, the scale of that business is decreased to a point where it's no longer efficient. And so then the remaining heirs of that farm are forced to sell the rest of the farm because it's not competitive any longer. And consequently, the farm dies with the farmer. And then the heirs are no longer a part of agriculture, and the community suffers because that farm is no longer in business. Farming is dominated by families. 99% of the farms in this country are owned and operated by families. Families like mine. I happen to be the middle generation of a 3-generation family farm. My father's 87 years old and worries every day about how that farm will make that transition from him to myself, and from myself to my sons. And we have worked regularly since the 1960s to develop
a transition program that would allow that to happen. And yes, we have opportunities available to assist in making the transition and to minimize the impact of the death taxes, but it's expensive. And with the economy of agriculture as it is today, to expect that farmer, as he plans his estate, to include accountant fees and attorney fees in his annual operating expenses is really more than the farm can endure. And so the cash that's available has to be used for the regular operating expenses, seed, feed, fertilizer, et cetera, and estate planning goes without being dealt with. And we find farmers that then have no provision to pass that farm on. Farmers and ranchers have spent their life building that business, and they've paid taxes on all of the income that has been generated from that farm. And now, having to be forced with making that transition at the time of death, they have to, again, pay a very, very unfair death tax, as you've heard described so well here this morning, in order to allow that farm to continue on and be operated by their sons and daughters and their heirs. So, in our opinion, there is absolutely no good reason to continue with the death tax. And from the selfish perspective of agriculture, there are nearly 2 million good reasons to kill the death tax. That's the number of farmers and ranchers that we have out across this country. I would certainly like to commend Senators Kyl and Ashcroft and Representatives Dunn and Weller for leading this fight to kill the death tax, and a special thank you to the Institute for Policy Innovation for providing the study and this opportunity for us to express our concerns about the death tax. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Peter Ferrara is here. He's an economist with the American Taxpayer, with Americans for Tax Reform. Why don't you come on up?
Thank you, Tom. Well, the government calls it the estate tax, and opponents call it the death tax, but I like to call it the vulture tax. And the reason it's the vulture tax was actually pointed out by Jim Martin of 60 Plus and by Senator Ashcroft. All the savings in this estate were already taxed when they were earned. So the estate tax is just a double tax. It's the government waiting like a vulture, and as soon as the producer dies, it swoops in and ravages the remaining savings it didn't get the first time. And I think that's wrong. Can you believe it? Here we have a supposed tax, which when everything is added up, as this study shows, as this excellent study shows, in fact probably generates no net revenue for the government. Yet it's the chief destroyer of the family farm and the small businesses in America. It's a tax which is justified by social envy of the rich, which the rich do not pay, and instead the hardworking entrepreneurial middle class is the one that suffers. Well, I'm sorry, but that is so wrong that it can only be characterized as the public policy equivalent of a hate crime. Americans for Tax Reform is the largest grassroots taxpayer organization in the United States, and we heartily commend Gary and Aldana Robbins for producing yet another excellent study in a long series of excellent studies, making them among the top public policy analysts in America. And we strongly support the efforts of Congresswoman Dunn, Congressman Cox, Senator Ashcroft, and Senator Kyl, who are showing great leadership in trying to repeal the estate tax, an act which is long overdue. Thank you very much.
Peter, tell us how you really feel about the estate tax.
I want to be clear.
Yes. Bo Bolter with the United Seniors Association is here. Bo, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Tom. I doubt that most of our members have to worry about this tax. I think we have 650,000 members, and I've been told that maybe the average income is $27,000 a year or something like that. Still, however, as Jim Martin said of his members, at United Seniors Association, we know that our members do not like this tax. They believe, that they want a better life for their children and their grandchildren, and it just is not fair after they've paid payroll tax, capital gains tax, ad valorem tax, property tax, sales tax, income tax, that here we go again with this estate tax. That's not what America was built on. America was built on the dream that if you worked hard and toiled hard, if you really had the work ethic, that you could build up an estate for your children and your grandchildren. So we wholeheartedly endorse this study. We enjoy working on many projects with Gary and Aldana Robbins, and we want to help the congressional leadership end this tax. And all of the talk about targeted tax cuts, if there's anyone that should be targeted for death and extinction, it's this one. And so we're glad for the opportunity to be here and participate in this today. Thank you.
Thanks, Bo. Eric Schlecht is here with the National Taxpayers Union. And when Eric is finished, we will open it up for questions.
Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Eric Schlecht. I am with the National Taxpayers Union. We're a grassroots organization with over 300,000 members nationwide supporting lower taxes and smaller government. I will keep this brief. There's no need to repeat all the good points that have already been mentioned, except to say that the current level of taxation in America is approaching all-time highs. Not since World War II has the government taken such a large chunk of the American economy. The average American family currently spends more in taxes than it does on food, clothing, and shelter combined. While such an extreme level of taxation during a person's lifetime is financially oppressive and inherently unfair, the government doesn't believe that your responsibility to participate in the income redistribution game ends with your death. After taxing you almost every conceivable way throughout your lifetime, the tax man follows you to the grave for one final reach into your wallet. Like the greedy cousin no one knows who shows up at the funeral with hat in hand, expecting his piece of the pie, the government has no compassion and very little tact. When closely examined, the death tax is probably the most morally offensive of all the taxes levied on Americans. For over 200 years, countless millions have immigrated to the land of opportunity with dreams of making a better life for themselves and their children. And yet the death tax punishes them for any success they may have in this regard. Parents work hard their entire lives to provide for their children, often working long hours and missing many important moments in their children's lives. They do so in an attempt to assure a better life for their children than they had, to help make it possible for their children to work just a little less so that perhaps they, in turn, can spend more time with their children. The idea of government interfering with hard-working, successful Americans attempting to give their loved ones a better life than they had flies in the face of one of our nation's most cherished principles. Restricting taxpayers from providing for their families is punitive and immoral. In addition to its adverse effects on families, the death tax is especially damaging to small business and family-owned farms, as has been mentioned, many of which are forced into bankruptcy or insolvency when forced to pay these levies. Disproportionately hard hit are minority-owned businesses. For these and many other reasons, the death tax should be repealed fully and immediately. NTU applauds everyone here today who is fighting to do just that and would encourage all members of Congress to join us in this fight. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. We will take questions if there are any questions. If you would just state who your question is for. Yes, sir.
Yes. This is a question, if any. I noticed that Senator Kyl and Congresswoman Dunn all left. If any of their staff people are here, have any hearings or markups been scheduled for any of the estate tax repeal bills?
I don't know that do we have any staff members in the room? Yes.
We haven't got hearings scheduled on it yet. We're waiting until after the budget resolution is acted on.
Okay. Any other questions? Questions for the authors about the study? Yes. Hey, George.
George Kyl, the National Tax Limitation Committee, which, by the way, also supports strongly the repeal.
Thank you.
Gary, this is Oral Donna for you. What do you think the odds are that we would ever get scored, the repeal bill, in at least a revenue-neutral fashion? I mean, you clearly showed that on a dynamic basis it might raise money, and that might help the budget situation.
I don't believe we would get it scored quite the way that we scored it, but I think that what you'll find is that over time we'll begin to get more realistic scoring as CBO starts to entertain a little bit more dynamic activity in their analysis.
Do you think that could help the political odds if you look at least a few years, 5-year budget projection?
In this case,
option?
in this case, the tax is really has so much economic disincentives associated with it. When the planning costs are as high as as the tax that's raised. And secondly, the dynamic costs of such a heavy tax also directly affects the GDP. I could hope that at least the people who are doing the revenue estimates would start to take into account some of that.
I'm not sure that we ever specifically stated this morning that one of the conclusions of the study, if looked at dynamically through the Robbins model, after 10 years, that federal revenues are actually higher than otherwise by eliminating the estate tax. You're not going to get those kind of numbers from CBO using their static methods, but if you look at it honestly, if you take growth effects and if you take incentive effects into effect, federal government doesn't lose revenue, they gain revenue through eliminating the estate tax. Any other questions? We certainly appreciate you all coming this morning. If you have any personal one-on-one questions for any of the panelists that are here, please feel free to hang around. Otherwise, have a good morning.